How are we doing, Netfa?
Is she okay? Live now. Go ahead.
Okay. All right. Greetings, folks. My name is Toivo Asheke, and I just really wanted to welcome you all to our, event today entitled "Collective Pride: Embracing Black Queer Solidarity." Essentially, a discussion on Black LGBTQ allyship and solidarity from Namibia to Black America. We have really a great panel and a group of folks who want to chat and build with folks today, and I should say LGBTQ IAP plus, given some of the visibility folks have been talking about today about different elements of the struggle. But essentially, folks, we wanted to kind of create a space today just so within the context of Black internationalism, hence, us working with the Black Alliance for Peace, we wanted to sort of facilitate a conversation amongst just the global Black radical queer struggle, and getting grassroots activists and scholars and human beings and peoples in discussion today. So just real brief for folks, we have Deonce, great activist, Black trans activist from Namibia, who's going to be sort of guiding us through some of the discussions around the LGBTQ IAP plus struggle in Namibia for about 15, 20 minutes and some open comments. And then we have Graciela and Marina, who are going to be giving just kind of Q&A, but just also discussion, talking about the struggle as it is here, particularly people like Graciela coming from the South, U.S. South, and Marina also coming from the Caribbean, who also find themselves, here in the U.S., to have this kind of a global struggle. So global struggle discussion. So I'm going to ask the different panelists to briefly give introductions, and then we're going to hand it over to Deonce to sort of take us away in some of this, some of the thoughts and conversations and things that we would like people to think about. Just for some brief context on people, Namibia is a country in Southern Africa. If I had my computer out, I get my maps going on so people can see, where all these places are. But we're a country in Southern Africa, won our independence. We call it flag independence in 1990, about 4 years before South Africa. And like South Africa, we struggled against what you call the apartheid regime, right? Essentially, for those of you in the US, think of it as Jim Crow on steroids. Very much a repressive white supremacist regime that had a religious and social component to it, as well as an economic and political one that folks oftentimes don't talk about. And that's important because many of the homophobic, racist laws that we have, and socially conservative laws that we have in Namibia date straight from the apartheid era when apparently we had independence in 1990, and that's part of what many of the young Black feminists, the queer movement back home, and the poor people's movement back home is fighting to transform. So with that, I'm just going to ask, maybe just in order, Deonce, then Marina and Graciela, to briefly introduce yourselves, and then we're going to hand it over to Deonce. I will turn off my camera and we'll let this go. Thank you all for coming.
Alrighty, thank you for having me. My names are Deonce Cleopatra Shaniquenaris. My pronouns are she, her, and hers. I am primarily a trans rights activist. I head up community-based organization called Transgender, Intersex, and Androgynous Movement of Namibia. But other than that, I'm also a sort of grounded human rights activist that does other work outside of trans rights related to youth, children, women. Yeah.
Um, Hi, I'm Marina McGlure, she, they pronouns. I'm a queer Black feminist educator, scholar, writer. Um, yeah, and I'm just happy to be here today, making connections across diaspora and within the American South with Deonce and Graciela. And yeah, I think I'll have more to say later, but I'll pass it on to Graciela.
Good morning, y'all. My name is Graciela. My pronouns are they, them, and theirs. I am a student over at Georgia State University in the Africana Studies Department. A lot of where I come from and situate is, from the perspective of a Black, Latinx, queer person from the South. And my background's just working with folks living with HIV, excuse me, LGBT youth, and just doing abortion abortion access and trying to get like folks, funded or getting folks like information around that. And yeah, just like navigating some of like the student suppression that like students across the US and, global South are like currently experiencing. I had the pleasure of studying abroad this summer and being able to connect with some students that were doing encampments on campuses. So yeah, I'm just really excited to be in conversation today and just like think through and just like struggle together around and like, scheme up together, share, all the things. And so, yeah, just like really excited to be here and just be in conversation with you all.
All right, Deontay, take it away.
Alrighty. Well, I mean, essentially, perhaps I should start by giving context of LGBT organizing in the country. So our first Pride Parade was held in around, is it 1999? Around the same time, our founding father made his first open homophobic statement that really incited violence, particularly at that time towards lesbian and gay persons, because those were the only two identities that were known in the country, that had the language in the country, which then meant one of our oldest organizations that was at that point called the Rainbow Project was established out of the need for that. And it actually was helped, co-founded by lesbian feminists at that point in time, who were organizing under the feminist umbrella and not necessarily utilizing their queer umbrella openly. And at that point also, it was when the HIV pandemic was really hitting. It was, the whole stigma around it being a gay man's issue. And so the gay man went to the lesbians and asked the lesbians for help and said, hey, you have the space, could we? And essentially that's how the movement grew. And once TRP collapsed around 2010 due to funding issues, our oldest now organization, Outright Namibia, was founded. And that, again, was a community of equally lesbian, gay, bisexual, trans people for the first time that came together and really saw the need to organize. And our organizing started from a health entry point, which was access to HIV medication treatment, which I think is essentially how most organizations started out in the country. At that point, we only had one LGBT organization, we had one sex worker organization, and both were led by Black queer women. The one by the sex worker organization led by a transgender woman, the other by a lesbian woman. And over the course of that period, as we were sort of incubating activists and training and figuring out what our issues were, we started diversifying what we were looking at. We started at HIV, and then from HIV access, it was really the denial of services that we had to move to, that people were experiencing both at healthcare and then at the police stations, because the police brutality towards particularly Black queer women, especially transgender women, was rife at that point, right? There were so many attacks happening. And so we had to start doing police advocacy and educating and sensitization and training. And that's where the bulk of the work has been, until recently, where a lot more of the youth started getting involved in the conversation. And mind you, the seniors have a more diplomatic way of doing their activism. So closed door conversations, direct contact with parliamentarians. Whereas the youth are a little bit more radical. They want to take to the street and they want to march and they want to call people out, which also had that generational difference thing happening between the two groups as we came into 2015. And we started now the young people mobilizing, and strategic litigation became a thing because as much as we keep sensitizing and advocating and we're writing to our politicians, it seemed to kept falling on deaf ears, right? And so even the growth of the movement, we sit now with, is it about 18 organizations? 3 sex worker organizations, 15 LGBT organizations. Out of the 15 LGBT organizations, we have about 5 in rural. The 10 try and do national work, but most of them are really based in city areas. So our rural communities aren't getting as much attention as they should be. So a lot of the times, again, there's a huge hype that happens in the cities around pride marches and court cases, and the communities in the rural areas get left behind, while they also are the ones that feel most of the impact of the advocacy and the visibility work that is happening in the cities. Part, maybe if I can fast forward quickly to our sort of biggest impact things that are happening right now, is that we have won all of our cases so far that we've brought with strategic litigation, the one around family and bringing Paula and Maya home, making sure that they have documents here at home. Then the court cases around the recognition of same-sex marriages, again won in high court. More recently, the unconstitutionality around the sodomy law, and some of the sections of the Criminal Procedures Act that criminalizes same-sex activities between 2 consenting male adults. Again, the High Court declaring that unconstitutional. Every time we win with those, the Attorney General appeals. So with the same-sex recognition, we went to the Supreme Court and we won in the Supreme Court again. The Supreme Court said Namibia must recognize same-sex marriages between a Namibian and a foreign partner constituted in foreign jurisdictions as any other marriage that is concluded in that manner, which still means 2 Namibians that have gotten married outside of the country, marriages are not recognized. So that is another struggle that we must head back to court for. But we won that. Paula and Maya, with the citizenship of the 2 kids, we lost on a technicality. And also something that, again, the lawyer set on from the state that they knew this was a simple document that needed to be filed. We didn't actually even need to go to the High Court to be able to win. But for some reason, that was skipped through the bureaucracy. The more recent is the sodomy case, and the High Court declared the existence of the sodomy law, which, by the way, is the 1980 law. It's a Roman Dutch law, just so we know, from our colonial era, and it was declared unconstitutional. Some of the sections within the Criminal Procedure Act was declared unconstitutional. And for about 27 days, we were celebrating because we thought, oh, the state has taken this one with pride. And then just on the last 2 days that the state had to appeal, the Attorney General filed an appeal. But what we also know with a lot of these court cases that we win is that with our Supreme Court case win around the recognition of same-sex marriages, a private member's bill was introduced in Parliament that passed in under 2 weeks, 2/3 majority, no objections with the lower house and the upper house. At some point, the upper house even wanted to introduce a death penalty, which again would have been unconstitutional because Namibia's constitution has the protection to life, right? But this was some of the things. The bill at the moment is lying on the president's desk. It was on the late president's desk. It is on this current president's desk. We have now heard from his press secretary that he is not in a rush to sign it. He is consulting widely because it affects other Namibians' rights, right? And so every time we have a win, something pops up. The Minister of Home Affairs now went and introduced a completely different marriage bill that outlaws and does not recognize same-sex marriages. They've also introduced penalties for people that solemnize same-sex marriages. Also, for witnessing same-sex marriages, you could basically be fined about 100,000 Namibian dollars, and or 6 months, I think, imprisonment. So these are all the little things that are happening around that. We also know every time we've had a significant win or a significant amount of visibility as queer people in the country, that a body drops. And it's usually a body of a Black transgender woman that drops. With our, is it Supreme Court case, we had 3 trans women's bodies drop back to back. So far in the country, we've had just between November last year and this time around, we've had 6 bodies dropped. 3 transgender women, 3 gay men, and 1 transgender woman brutally assaulted, but she survived the attack. Again, also our parliamentarians would keep arguing, are these hate crimes? Are they not? And we keep saying, when you look at the brutality, when you look at the mannerisms that people are being killed and buried in, that these are definitely linked also to significant events that are linked to LGBT plus persons in the country, right? So that essentially is where we're finding ourselves right now. It's election year. So the queer issue is really at the forefront. It's in every paper, almost every week. It is a topic of discussion. It keeps popping up in our parliament. Just during this week, we had 3 political leaders again come out and make statements around them not being interested in dealing with this nonsense of LGBT and, you know. And we know every time somebody does that in parliament, obviously, it leads to incitement of more violence against LGBTQ plus persons. Yeah, I mean, in terms of context, that's where we are. Really, LGBT advocacy for us in the country is also now only moving into spaces of economic emancipation, as only moving into issues around housing and sanitation and employment, and claiming all of our other socio-economic and political rights, despite the more marriage and those conversations that are really being used again to cloud all of our other needs. If I can breathe there.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for that, Deonce. So yeah, it's open. Marina, Graciela, if you want to just jump in with questions, comments, if you want to even explain some context here, no problem. We don't want to kind of set this up like as some, formalistic type of thing. We have some things that we'll put on the table. Just whoever feels they want to jump in, please do.
I can go ahead. Wow, thank you so much, Deonce. I have so many questions and I'm so excited to be in conversation. But maybe just to kick it off, I guess I wanted to talk about the different terms under the LGBTQIA umbrella and their, I guess, local specificity. Because I was really interested to hear you list androgynous as one of the terms, since that's not really, I guess, I don't know, that's not something that we typically see under the umbrella in America. And I just want us to talk about that a little bit more, because that seems like a kind of like coalition building move, maybe with people who are gender nonconforming, but don't necessarily identify as queer. I'm thinking a lot, I guess, about all of the debate and discussion around like Iman Khalif, for example. I don't know. So just kind of like including androgynous people, like whether self-identified or identified by society as androgynous, is really interesting to me. And I'm also wondering maybe just kind of like what indigenous or like non-English language terms all of us are bringing to the table to describe queerness, transness, gender nonconformity, same gender intimacy. Like what cultural terms are we all bringing to the table, and how might those be useful, or how are those maybe like understood in all of our different contexts? Like might be a nice thing to talk about as well.
Well, yeah, I mean, if I can go ahead, part of my work, again, more recently, also discovering that I have spiritual gifts that I have not been utilizing. Um, and my grandmother coming for me more recently, I had to take up the spiritual journey, but that also has me doing a little bit more decolonial work around queer identities. And I am recently working on a project that is helping define language as we use it as queer people, right? Now, the first starting off with the whole androgynous thing, the term, the umbrella, for us to include it in essence, also the name of the organization. It took about a 2-year negotiation between the founders to agree on it eventually. And because also the organization started out Trans Activist Movement of Namibia. And at that point, trans identities were just trans femme, trans mass, and were not accommodative of other bodies that existed in between the spectrum. And I think I probably was the person that fought the hardest. And we had to decide, are we leaving it as androgynous? Are we doing gender non-conforming? What's the words that we're choosing to use? And then we had to settle on androgyny because it sort of included then almost everybody that did not necessarily want to identify under a binary, and how we understood it at that point as the country. There are more liberal definitions that keep popping up. And even now, we are having that debate around, well, not a lot of people are taking up androgynous as an identity, as a label, but more people are picking up gender nonconformity as an identity and as a label. So is it relevant for us to then have that androgyny there, and continue using it as language? And at this point, we're saying, well, even with gender nonconformity in itself as a country, people are picking it up and using it as a very specific label. And so we would perhaps want to hold on to androgyny to be even more flexible with even allies of queer women, that are queer in expression, but not necessarily identity, that align themselves with the organization to be able to. And then around local language with the work that I'm doing, there's quite a lot of local vernacular that's popping up at the moment. A lot of the conversations that I'm having with some of the elders that I'm picking up would then say to you, we have had people like you exist in our communities, and these are the local words that we've been using. But somewhere along the line, you came and now you are telling us the words are derogatory. And so we now don't know what to use, right? And some of these words, when you sit down and you listen to their origin and where they came from, do not actually even have a negative connotation or a derogatory connotation. It is when we translate them into the English language that they become problematic. And so when I try, and even with some cultural practices, the conversation now is some people actually would want to go through some of the initiation ceremonies that are happening. The only struggle that we've had with culture is perhaps the is a choice, and not giving people a choice whether they want to participate in the ceremonies or not, and then make these things problematic. So even when my grandmother is turning 70 something, and with my journey, we've been having the conversation, and she says, in every generation, we've had one of you. And it is when actually the churches came that practicing some of our cultures and those things were problematic. And the first people that had to go was actually people like you, because we were, particularly as trans people, and in our culture, it's called Suridava as a word. Um, and people of that nature were identified as the spiritual mediums, as the persons that were responsible for our spirituality and the way our practices and basically the history of our communities, right? And so when the white man came and they needed to do a wipeout, they needed to start with the custodians of our spirituality, which were the trans people. And hence now the argument is no, they've never existed. We've never had them. But you had to get rid of the way again, we were also not pen and paper people. So there wasn't a way that we could write these things down. And the little bit of knowledge that is there sits with our elders at the moment. I was recently speaking to an author that does African literature, and I was saying to them, at some point, somebody really needs to sit down with my grandmother before we lose this wealth of information around the existence of trans identities, particularly within the Damara culture, and how we were revered and how we practiced our spirituality. And that is essentially probably also one of the reasons why the Damara culture is more tolerant and more accepting of especially trans communities within our Namibian context. Whereas in other cultures, there is the existence of language, but we also know the existence of violent cultural practices towards queer bodies, again, brought in by white religion, because we know the reason why Avambo speaking people are so violent to communities, I guess, is because as gay men, as persons that were receptive partners in same-sex unions, if somebody found out that a practice like that was happening, they would literally heat up an iron rod and insert it into somebody's private parts, right? Which put the fear of God and all those things into people's minds, that if you were like that, this is what would happen to you. And so we can't. But there is definitely room for including more local vernacular, more native language. I've seen with my advocacy that it relaxes the room even a little bit more. It makes the conversation a little bit more palatable when you are speaking to elders and parents and, community leaders. And it's really been the one thing, because I remember spending I almost used my other French. I spent a whole half of a morning talking to traditional leaders from the Nama and Damara culture. And we could not understand each other until we get to about tea break. And one of the chiefs calls me over and he says, Etse, what are you talking about? And I say to him, but I'm talking about people like myself that identify like this. And then he says, Ah, man, wait, let me make a phone call. And he calls somebody, and this is his senior advisor. And his senior advisor shows up, and this is a trans masculine person. And he says, but this has been your role as advisors of chiefs. It should not even be a struggle for us to be fighting each other because you've had a particular role that you played in our communities. Um, the one thing that made me a little bit uncomfortable around his conversation was it is when we choose to be so loud and so visible that the violence escalates, and I guess people start having problems with us. But we've always been people that have existed on that side, quiet. You are noticed when we need you to come and do your baptisms and your what is it? Oh, cleansings and your, the spiritual and cultural practices that we were the custodians for. Um, and that's it. Basically, when we start flaunting it in people's faces, it becomes a problem.
Wow, I have so many responses, but I want to give Graciela a chance to go ahead and respond as well. So I will maybe like step back unless you want me to go, Graciela.
Yeah, no, so many things that you've been saying has like definitely resonated. And, I can definitely speak to just like that last point that you were saying is just like, as like queer folks, we kind of have to like play this like specific role. And, I'm thinking about as like, coming off of like Pride, a lot of my friends or like folks that I am like in community with really just like brought a lot of these like interlocking struggles together, and we felt so much suppression from the state, from each other, of like, no, like Pride Month is only like this certain way, Pride Month is celebrated, only these certain types of things can be uplifted. But using that month to really speak to like the suppression that like our Palestinian comrades are going through, the things that like Black and brown folks are going through, and just like getting a lot of pushback, like even within community, of like, no, this is like a time where we're supposed to be celebrating Pride, but it's like, no, this is not where we at right now, y'all. Like, we are in the trenches right now. It is raggedy out here. Like, there is nothing to be like prideful about, not, in the US context and the international context, just because of like so many struggles that are coming up right now, even around like, something you were talking about, with the AIDS epidemic. We're seeing so much like HIV incarceration, bodily incarceration due to folks like trying to get access to abortion, student suppression. We're still seeing mass like murders of like Black trans women here in the US, and definitely in the global South, as you were speaking to as well. And so, yeah, I think it's like so hard because even around like that language piece, we're still missing some folks because like Black trans women are being misgendered when they're being murdered at, these like high rates. Being from Jacksonville, Florida, a lot of like how I was even politicized through like music when I was working like at the LGBT clubs. Jacksonville in 2018 was the city where the most Black trans women were being murdered, but nobody in the city was like talking about this or even like bringing to light like what was going on, because one of the first two of the women were not recognized as like Black trans women. They were misgendered by the police. And so it's just like seeing like even that erasure like in that way, and not using this like language for however reasons, like if folks want to stay south, or even the families coming in and taking autonomy over like the bodies of these like trans women, and so they're erasing like their whole lineages. And so yeah, it's just like so many like connections that I see across like what you're speaking to and now. And I think like something that really was coming up for me, especially when you were talking about these like interlocking struggles that were also like working in coalition together, especially when you were talking about sex workers. I was thinking about Sylvia Rivera, like Marsha P. Johnson, and like Star, and like trying to like bring that work within like the LGBT struggle, like even as early as like Stonewall, but getting pushback from those communities like, no, 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 like that's not what we're talking about right now, like we're trying to get married. And it's like, no, mamas was like, that does not need to be our point right now, like we got deeper things. We getting our, I don't want to cuss, but we getting our asses beat by the police right now. That's what we need to be worried about, not trying to get married, And so I'm wondering, like, are you still seeing like those like interlocking like struggles, like working in coalition together, especially when you're talking about like, the men that are living with HIV coming to the lesbians and like wanting to work like together. I mean, that was just like such a beautiful way to like even think about it. And it makes me think about, the Combahee River Collective and just the work that they tried to do to kind of bring some of these like struggles together. And I'm curious if you're still seeing that like relationship happening within like the queer community to kind of battle like some of these struggles together.
Yeah, no. I think like Toive was saying, part of the reason why I am sort of at the center of of the LGBT movement is because I try and bring all those struggles together, right? Again, if you look at a lot of the sex worker organizations in the country, they are led by Black trans women. If you look at a lot of the rural organizations, again, they are led by Black transgender women. A lot of them that also come with sex worker history. But I completely hear what you're saying, and it keeps popping up more and more these days around these push and pulls in between. I mean, even with the trans movement itself, Jesus, earlier in the year, I almost jumped over the table for one of my very own sisters that sat there and says, um, well, I mean, no offense, but a trans man will never be man enough for me. And I'm like, girl, what? Girl, don't, oh, Jesus, Lord. Oh, yeah, no, I was almost, the moderator had to come in there and just cool things down. Because I'm like, God, we are one family here. So if you say that about another trans person, then excuse me, sister, then you ain't never going to be enough too, right? So at some point, we really need to start having these conversations with each other when my very own sisters in the room, when I sit there and I talk about trans diversity on all of its spectrum, are telling me, no, we don't know what you're here talking about, homegirl. I'm like, not all transgender women want to talk. Not all transgender women want to go through reassignment surgery. Excuse us over here. And then my sisters will say to me, well, then you must just go to the gay movement. I'm like, excuse me. What is happening here? Why are we going backwards? I thought the whole anti-trans rhetoric was happening out there, not in the same room where I'm also sitting. But it seems to have found its way in here. You know, it's even when the marriage conversations were happening, and I was sitting in the room and I kept saying to people, well, I mean, that's not necessarily we doing.
I
Excuse me.
think
Yeah.
think we lost that last point that you were saying, Deontay. On my end, it went out a little bit, but you're
Yes,
speaking to just like some of that, anti like trans rhetoric, like living within
yeah.
community.
There's quite a lot, even with the is it the court case around same-sex marriages. And I was saying, can we nuance the language, right? Can we, I know it's gay men and it's lesbian women in court at the moment, but could we do at least something with the language around here? And it fell on deaf ears. And you know what happened? When the private members bill was being tabled, the language came for trans people. And it was written in such a way that it says marriage will only exist between people of the opposite sex. And then it says when it defines spouse, spouse will be a man or a woman born biologically male or female. And I said to people, you see what happened? You see what happened? Now the backlash again is being felt by trans people. So we need to start figuring this thing out where we must start talking to each other as a community. That's why in the beginning, people did not see me show up at the court cases, especially those that were related to same-sex marriage. And the same thing happened when the sodomy case was happening. And I was saying, I understand you want to keep identity out of it, but the act affects transgender women because we come in male bodies. And so when you're putting out this language again, could we find a way to nuance it? Not happening. When we get to it, we all must also recognize that the faces of this movement are Black transgender women. And so the first initial impact is being felt by Black transgender women and women of color and women in rural areas, because they're the ones that have to navigate the public transport system. They're the ones that have to walk down the street to be able to get a potato. They're not the ones ordering online. They are the ones that must go and beg for services at the public health system. They're not going to a private doctor, right? So when we're doing these things, I constantly am always trying to make sure that we have an element of intersectionality without tokenism and without the intersecting identities losing their worth, value, and identity. Because God, I know it's only now that I am intersecting very well. I used to get angry every time I heard the word because it came with feminists and funding and feminists being required and the women's movement being required to intersect with transgender women. And then they will invite you to the event and not even make room for gender affirming toilets or whatever. You are constantly being misgendered at a women's conference that is intersecting with transgender women's issues. Then you see the whole goddamn agenda primarily shaped towards cisgendered women's issues. And every time you try and get in there, even with the sexual reproductive health and rights conversation, oh my God, every time I sit in this room of bodily autonomy and integrity, I want to shoot somebody. Thank God we do not have liberal gun licensing things happening here. Otherwise, I would be sitting in jail. God help us all. I am like, when the abortion conversation was happening, and I step into the room, and people looked at me like, the hell is she doing here? How is she affected by this issue? And I'm like, one, you're not going to define what my sexual practices are for me. So if I engage in sexual practices with female-bodied persons, irregardless of how they identify, trans, mass, or butch, lesbian, or whatever, and require access to abortion, we should be able to access that abortion without you coming to label and put things on what our identities are and what we should be doing with those bodies. And also, I speak for trans masked bodies that go through violent family situations that at some point might require abortion services. And it might also not be related to violence because these bodies also engage in sex work that could have had an accident and want to take care of this accident. And now this body must go through violence because we are out here shaping abortion like it's just a cis women's issue. I'm just like, wait, what's happening, you know?
Mm. I have so many things to say about that, but I'll let you go, Marina.
Yeah, same. Oh my goodness. Because I mean, I guess it does strike me like in the way that right now you're talking about Black trans women being the face of so many political and social movements that affect people beyond Black trans women. I feel like it does kind of take us back to that earlier point you made as well. I'm just gonna like quote you here because it was really good. When the white men came and they needed to do a wipeout, they needed to target the custodians of our spirituality. So it kind of feels like it's like it feels like Black trans people have always kind of had this role or correct me if I'm wrong, but have always kind of had this social role that is stewarding and caretaking for the liberation and well-being of everyone and that they're so needed, and that's also like why they are targeted and maybe kind of in a kind of pre-colonial era it was more so focused on spirituality, but now it seems like the arena is politics. So that's kind of interesting to think about. I guess I also wanted to, because I think, it's just really similar to what I've seen go on in the Haitian context, right? Where I guess Haitian, because Haitian Vodou religion, which is like a kind of syncretic religion that's made up of, there are Christian elements, then there are also like West African, Congolese, and elements of Islam. Like, it's just like, it's a religion that came out of a society of enslaved people who didn't really know how to talk to each other necessarily because they were all taken from different cultural and ethnic contexts, and they had to learn how to talk to each other to have a revolution. So you can see the way that they learn to talk to each other, like in the religion itself. And this religion is like for revolution. It's like the spirits have machetes, the spirits are like directing people, but because the Haitian Revolution has been so demonized, like this religion has also been demonized. And this religion has also been a space where queer and gender nonconforming people have always been at home because, it's a possession-based religion, like spirits will possess people regardless of gender, so you will often see, like cis men kind of performing, I guess, I don't know, like it's like possession is like a bit performative, right? Like when a spirit possesses somebody, it always has the same personality. So you will see like cis men performing the personality like of a feminized spirit, and cis women performing the personality of a masculinized spirit. So just kind of like thinking about what these cultural contexts have to offer us and just kind of how revolutionary they are and why that also kind of being a source of why people are targeted. And just kind of like thinking about I wanted to think about the ways that we can use that, especially in these kinds of conversations. Like I wanted to hear more maybe about the like rural and urban divide. And especially, maybe going back to a point that you had made about, I don't know if this is you can tell me actually if this is necessarily a point about rural versus urban, but this idea that like, okay, like perhaps urban people are going into rural areas and telling people about like language around queerness and telling them that the terms they have used before are derogatory. So what do they do? I'm kind of interested in that question of like, what is the role and dialogue between like rural and urban, maybe like more westernized and traditional ways of interfacing. Because yeah, it does strike me that, I mean, just kind of knowing my own context, like the Haitian terms Masisi and Madivin, Masisi meaning Masisi being an umbrella term that encompasses gay men and trans women, and Madivin, which holds lesbians and trans men. Those have, kind of come to take on a derogatory meaning in a homophobic society. But then, you also, because they're the only terms that exist in Haitian Creole in the local language, people self-identify and have used them to self-identify. And then, something really interesting and beautiful that I'm seeing in Haitian diaspora in the Americas, is that people will also like identify as Masisi. Like there's like in Miami, there's a whole party and like cultural collective called Masisi, for example, that I had the great privilege to, be part of and, like be in social space with. So, just kind of thinking about that, like I feel like that's that's like a really interesting friction point, right? Where it's like people have their own local terms that are derogatory, but are maybe in the process of being reclaimed. And, kind of what is the role of people who are using maybe more of the language of like LGBTQ, et cetera? Is that a fracture point, I guess, between rural and urban communities? And definitely want to hear more about like all of the other fracture points that have been brought up, the generational fracture points, and and like that kind of like fracture point between like trans femme and trans masc as well was really poignant to me. But yeah, sorry, that was a lot. But I will pass it on and see who wants to take up any part of what I've said.
Yeah, no, Graciela, I'm not sure if you want to go. I could touch base quick.
Please take it.
Yeah, so with the language thing, definitely tricky, right? Because again, it's really a lot of, especially for us in Namibia, the words linked to local vernacular, you will find affirming language, and then you'll find some of the words that people would deem derogatory, depending on the context that it is used in, right? So, for instance, in the Kwekwe language, you'll find Suridavap as a word that is used as an umbrella for everybody that identifies as LGBTQ. And directly translated, it just means gender switch, right? Then you find the other word that you would use, which is kamaf. And that generally is a word that was used towards an animal that could not conceive, or towards women that could not conceive. So then in that context, it's almost saying queer people can't conceive, basically, which again has not been a word deemed offensive by the Damaranama queer community. They actually use it amongst themselves. But it is in the way you would use it towards a queer person that would make the word offensive, right? So, and when you look at language in urban versus rural, of course, those of us, and somebody was saying it in a WhatsApp group the other day, they posted a little snippet of something, and then they were saying, this sounds like Beyonce and Linda in their workshops, like they swallowed the Oxford Dictionary from Cambridge. So when we walk into the rooms half the time, when we're out there and we're gender diversity and LGBTQ plus and sexual orientation and sexual characteristics, what not, the rural people aren't necessarily connecting to that language. But when you sit down with them and you start using the more local language and the more local those things they connect to. So with my activism, I've sort of tried and blend the both, but I try to make sure a lot of our interventions are very context specific, because you cannot use the same language that you'd probably use in the south of Namibia and the north of Namibia, because the south of Namibia is more liberal than the north of Namibia is, right? They are more conservative up there, so you'll be more picky around some of the words you use. You'll use more local vernacular in the south, but you'd probably try and stay in English if you were in the north, because the way those words come out would really be offensive to somebody. Then when you look at rural and urban divide again, there's a lot more happening in urban in terms of organizing, in terms of gathering, in terms of mobilizing, sensitizing, the work that we do with governments and clinics and what not, compared to what would be happening in rural, right? So rural doesn't necessarily have as much access as urban would. But even within urban, you do find peri-urban and rural areas happening. For example, within the city of Windhoek, the area I work in is called Ochomise Rural. So again, the communities that I work with in that area does not necessarily have, even when it comes to ICT and technology, the same access as the other communities that live in the more urban suburbs. Um, Even the way we understand the issues, the way we experience the issues is not necessarily the same, even though we are living in the same city. Even with organizing, you will see people always come for me when I try and organize a taxi to bring the girls from the peri-urban areas into the more central areas. And my justification would be because, again, the public transport system, one, is problematic. Two, those ladies in that rural area do not necessarily have the same economic privileges or access that you in these upper suburbs have. You are able to get into your car and drive. You are able to order an Uber and drive because you can afford those. You have access to those. These women don't. They need to stand at the corner of the street where the street bullies usually sit to be able to take that taxi, right? We also know that in terms of safety, and again, I will speak primarily towards transgender women, is that rural seems to be a lot more safer than urban is, for transgender women, because they, I guess, find more community and more place in those close-knit networks. And again, it's related to how we associate as people, because when you look at the way community views transgender women, um, particularly in the areas where I work, they are responsible for nurturing and caring, and we look after the houses and we cook and we clean. That's some of the automatic labels that come with it. I struggle with it because I'm not a cooking and a cleaning type of girly. So usually I get shunted out of most of the girls because I want to sit over there and I don't want to be scrubbing hoofs and whatnot. So that always has me on the other end. But I think that sometimes is sort of the role that trans women take up. We are the first ones when there's a death in the family or in the community that gathers the people and that cleans up the houses quickly and makes it ready for everybody to be able to receive guests and whatnot. And, so that being the type of role that a lot of the women have has created this safety network within our communities that even the neighbor will protect you at some point, in depending on how and where you're interacting, but rural being a little bit more safer. Even when you look at the amount of bodies that are dropping in the country at the moment, they are dropping in urban areas, or rural areas and urban areas than really deep rural, right? So it's city rural that would have, yeah, those type of little impacts happening. But again, when you look at the sort of stigma and discrimination where and denial of service, around healthcare and police brutality, and particularly state-related service provision, it is in the rural areas where people don't really have much access to information or awareness on rights, that you will see that being experienced more prominent in rural, around denial to service or brutality or whatever, compared to urban, where people are a little bit more vocal and more open, and dare you not mess with anybody in the area where Beyonce lives, because somebody, when you even try, will say to you, you don't want to mess with that one. That one is from Beyonce's community, right? Because we've created those networks, or the visibility exists, that somebody knows in the area where Beyonce lives, or where Linda lives, or where who lives, you will not mess with a queer, compared to in the rural areas where there's not much activism or visibility, that people go through the most.
Yeah, I just want to take a moment to just like appreciate just the immense amount of like emotional, physical, mental, spiritual labor that you hold like in these communities. It makes me think about, my trans elders that are in Jacksonville that also are holding like so much of this like intersecting like issues, and just like not for my comrades that are maybe cisgender, and you were speaking a lot about like feminist movements not including like these conversations of like transness is just like an afterthought or just like a tack on, instead of like it actually being like central and how you say just yeah, just like a central part of like the movement, because it's like just because they are, I appreciate too, like when you're talking about like the language, like if they're not going to come for queer like folks or gay folks, they're going to come for trans folks, but it's still like this is all of our like communities together. So I just appreciate you just like in the work that you're doing to just like hold all of these communities together, and you're like siblings or sisters, however you describe them, that are also holding that labor as well. For me, it feels very frustrating because I would say that that is very much so the same, like within the US, as someone who's been like organizing within like, Black spaces or like queer spaces, the frustrating part, with it as identifying as trans, like being in Black spaces, like queerness is already an afterthought, but then transness is even more of an afterthought, and we're not even thinking about like disability justice or language justice within those like Black spaces, I will say. And then within like queer spaces, it's still like not addressing like race or class or even, transness still as well. Like trans communities are still even left behind. And I appreciate you uplifting so much, just like, the access that like trans masks need to have to like abortion. And I will even say, working within HIV case management, same with like, HIV like access and like the conversations that trans masks or folks are continuously left out of the conversations and even totally erased by the state. because in a lot of these like forums or like conversations that we have, transmasculine folks are not even like seen or, you know, documented or just like in conversation. But it's like the ways that like queer folks, we have always been like, you know, in communities with each other, always sexually, you know, physically, like all the things. And so it's just like deeply frustrating to see those erasures on like, you know, all like points, from Blackness to like queerness. And, you know, even when these spaces like come together, you know, there just needs to be more, you know, centralized ways that we're talking about like gender, you know, sexuality, class, you know, all these things like together. So I just wanted to throw that comment out there. It's just something that I noticed across, you know, both communities.
Hey folks, just wanted to jump in real quick. This has been really just great so far. I'm so happy that this is happening. Just to give a quick time check for 22 minutes, just to kind of keep that in people's heads. And part of what I wanted to do before we closed off, again, please, Deonce, anybody else, please jump on in and do what you have to do. I don't want to silence or curtail any convo, but what I did want to do, also Graciela and Marina, is also in some ways, you also are talking to a Namibian and Southern African population about the Black struggle in the US, right? What does that Black queer struggle look like? What a lot of people see the social media and they'll see a bunch of things, but what is it that you're wanting people, again, in 22 minutes, you can't give a whole deep spiel and messages, right? But the idea is,
Yes, but what
you know,
is it? What is it that they're doing over there? What is part of that struggle that, you know?
Precisely. So I would like if you just wanted to take some of that time, maybe, I don't know, Marina, Graciela, if you want to give a comment each sort of to tie some of these things together, also from your own specific localities. So, you know, because Deonce is one person, but there'll be a number of people who'll be watching this back home, right? So just maybe if you want us to give, I don't know, 5 minutes, some 5-10 minutes with some just thoughts on that. And then we can close with Deonce, because they just kind of close us off so we can be done at 9:30. So BAP can use this thing for something else. But if I could, I want to say just kind of just quick 1 minute things. It's just that I think this is such an important conversation, folks, because like I am Bambu. My father is Bambu and I am from the North, right? And we are disproportionately in the majority. It's not really a question. In other African countries, you do have more of an equal split between the ethnic groups. But given the Herero and Nama genocide that we must talk about, right, of the early 20th century, the first quote unquote genocide of the 20th century, that the Germans still have not done proper work in reparations, and that our government has not fought hard enough for, it just knocked out about 90% of the population of the center and the South. So a lot of what you also are seeing is people who have been dispossessed of land, Herero, Nama, Damara peoples and different peoples in the center of the South, in ways us in the North, it's not so much dispossession in as much as land contraction. So we have less land than we used to have, but we have levels of communal land, right? Versus, you know, those who are dispossessed. Right. And so that also plays a part in some of this, even culturally. Many of my, you know, friends and family who are Bambu are like, yeah, it's those Damara, Namas, and Hereros who are queer, or those ones who are there. It's actually considered like an ethnic group thing in certain kinds of ways, given the different colonial histories and relationships of things that have happened. And it's why I think it's important that this is happening on BAP, because sometimes I do think in some of the outside African experiences, we do like to kind of homogenize some of these things we see on the continent, sort of saying, well, we just support anything that, you know, Africa is coming after Africa, so we have to support Africa all the way. But yes, we do, but there's intricacies even within that. And particularly with many people who are in places like BAP, MXGM, and others, they are coming from an old school kind of thinking where SWAPO, ANC, and Frelimo and certain organizations have a particular status that they did have in the 80s or the 70s, but we're not in the 80s and 70s right now. We are here in a particular moment. So just wanted to kind of lay some of that out for people so people can have a sense of just what are the contexts around this. And I also think it's important, and this is me speaking to people back home also, I am someone who was raised, and I have a deep love and respect for our founding president, Sam Nujoma, who Deonce mentioned did make those homophobic comments and did actually participate in a whole bunch of verbal violence against our people. And I think it's important that we must say we can love some of these folks, but we must build and do better than they did. And back home, we don't have that conversation a lot, particularly in my ethnic group, particularly people like myself who is deep in SWAPO. I'm no longer SWAPO, but I am coming from that, right? But we have to critique that and also take accountability as Vambus, particularly het cis men in Vambu culture, for some of these things, because as we know, trans liberation, LGBTQ liberation is our own as well. Right. And we must begin to see those things very linked as well. So sorry for taking so much of that time there, but I just want to open that floor to Graciela, Marina, just, your 5 minute, 6 minute, 7 minute thing. What do you want some people in Southern Africa, Namibia to kind of know about the things here? Right. And again, we want to open this up for deeper convo. And I do want to last plug in. Deontay's out here taking care of kids. Deontay has her own Star House right there in the hood there, and is taking care of many of these kids who are not whose parents are either sex workers or who've been abandoned or who are homeless, et cetera. And what are some financial / concrete material connections we can make here? Because one of the things I also wanted to do with this conversation is a lot of the finances, right, that is able to fund some of the stuff back home is coming from white European NGOs or some of the government funding programs here. That it means Deontay has to essentially be beholden to some of these cats. Right. And what does it mean for us to do some kind of fundraising, which can even be $500 which would be 9,000 NAM dollars? Deontay will tell you what she can do with 9,000 NAM dollars. And that's money she ain't got to beg for some European crackers or some other, liberal Germans, right, who want to, help the Black people with their queer issues. You know what I'm saying? It means we can have some autonomy and some support and then some concrete things we can do to help each other on both sides of the Atlantic. So I also wanted to put that out there because Deontay, is running a Star House essentially with kids there who Deontay is taking care of. And these things, you know what I mean? So what does it mean also ourselves to concretely, materially support each other? So yeah, I just want to pass it over to Graciela, Marina, and then Deontay, please close us off.
Oh, so 5 minutes to encapsulate what's happening with Black folks across the US. 5 minutes. Yeah.
I don't even think Martin Luther King could achieve that.
So I will speak. So I think it's what is so hard for me is like my mind goes into so many places. Like, my partner's work is based in, the ballroom community and talking to elders within the ballroom. That's how I know about you, Deontay, is from, my partner speaking about those things. And I think I'm thinking about, my communities. So many things that you're speaking to is what is happening in the US. I will say that. There's like the struggles are the same internationally. I will say that. But what I want to kind of speak to is just like, at Georgia State, that's the school that I'm at, trying to just like really like bring pressure to my institution because Georgia State is directly involved with working with, Israeli forces, where we have a program that was started in 1992 called the Gilly program, where they are taking Israeli forces to the US, to my campus, to train them beside the, Atlanta Police Department. And then the Atlanta Police Department is, taking them over to Israel. And these same tactics that they're using and the same surveillance that they're using on the Palestinian people, they are using in our city alone. The surveillance system that is on my campus, that is, downtown, where there are so many folks experiencing homelessness. We have one of the largest Black student populations next to HBCU in the US, within Atlanta. And these police officers are, killing our people. They are, we're seeing folks within our jails that are dying, that have been dead for multiple days, being eaten by maggots. And our police are not, taking care of our folks, which we know that the pigs don't do that anyways. But, we're just seeing this like huge amount of suppression on students over at Emory, which is the university that Marina is at. You know, all of the students across Atlanta organized together. And, you know, HBCU students who were there, like working beside a lot of these students were some of the ones that were like, you know, brutally like beat up and tear gassed and jailed and, you know, dealing with court cases to this day. And so we're seeing, like, I would say for me anyways, in my perspective, you know, I'm seeing the solidarity that is happening across like student movements, but still students not understanding some of the risks that like Black students are taking by putting their bodies on the line, or, you know, maybe experiencing losing scholarships, or, you know, not being from homes that, you know, really respect the work that they're doing. And some of, you know, my white comrades not really stepping up and trying to like protect us while we're putting our bodies on the front line. And so I'm a little bit older than some of these students. I'm 32, you know, I came back to school. And so just trying to like, you know, take some of these babies up, just like you were talking about, and just letting them know, like, you know, our work can look so different. It doesn't always have to be on the front line. You know, I'm an artist, I DJ, and so using sound is something that I really love to do, especially when I'm in the clubs. You know, you'll hear me throw some Marsha P or some Sylvia Rivera over some like house beats and stuff like that. And so I think for me anyways, and like where I'm, and I'll close with this, where I'm trying to like give back to the movement in ways is like letting like my comrades know that like being on the front lines isn't always like where you have to be. Child, we need people in the spreadsheets. We need our community healers. We need, you know, our folks doing jail support. You know, there's so many different roles within the movement, you know, and being on the front lines is only like 2% of that work. And for some of these young people that, you know, these are the first times that they're coming within movement, is like, that's the first things that they see, and that they think that's all there is just like mobilizing people. But no, we also need organizers as well. Like mobilizing is just so little of the movement. The hard work is doing that like organizing part. And so, yeah, I would say for me, that's just kind of like what my focus is, even as I'm starting to like come out, because I'm going to be a senior this year, or I'm graduating this fall. That's also some of the hard part of being a student, doing student organizing, is that everything is like in a cycle, which is, it's beautiful, but then it's also like we have to do that organizing work and continuing to do that, and something that we can bring like back into like communities as well. But I'm so thankful to be able to be in conversation with you. And again, just thank you for all the labor and the work that you're doing. You know, something that my partner always says, and I'm going to say their name, Victor Benet, or Victor Omni, excuse me, they changed their name, is that, you know, the Marsha P. Johnsons and the Sylvia Riveras, they're already in our communities. They're already doing that work, and they're right there. And so you're right here. And I just appreciate you for just like continuing this, like, you know, Transcestor legacy that you're doing. And just, I know your community loves you and appreciates you. And I'm just happy to know that I have a comrade, you know, because I'm coming back to South Africa because that was beautiful. I got to come back over there.
Let's get you to cross the border over into Namibia.
That's it.
From our previous colonizer that came to rescue us and then decided to colonize us, but okay.
That's it. Speak to it.
Wow. Yeah, I'm also just so honored to be in conversation with both of you. And I want to like pick up on a couple points that both of you made to kind of make maybe my point about the state of Black queer trans activism in the US or whatever. So I think I was really struck at the beginning when Deoncé made the point of the seniors having a more diplomatic way of doing their activism and, you know, kind of reaching this breaking point of like, okay, you know, like after all the consciousness raising and the quiet conversations don't work anymore, where do we go? What tactics do we use? And I think that is kind of, to me, that's the horizon of LGBTQ organizing in the US right now. It's like, what do we do after gay marriage has been legalized? What do we do after, I don't know, I mean, I think even within my own lifetime, I'm 35, like even within my own lifetime, like when I came out, it was a big thing, whatever, you know, like now, you know, kind of just seeing younger generations and it's just so much more normalized and accepted. And, you know, we could say that's progress, but, you know, Black trans women are still being murdered en masse. And like, you know, like, it's like Graciela said before, you know, like, like, yeah, y'all are trying to get married. Some people over here trying to get married or whatever, but like, you know, like how do we actually better our material conditions? And bettering our material conditions is going to involve including a much broader cross-section of people that than just people who are under the LGBTQ umbrella. Like this is for everybody, even when unfortunately, like we don't always feel loved or supported by everybody, you know, like that's also part of it. I think a lot of it is just kind of like coalitional work that doesn't always feel rewarded in the moment, as I'm sure Deonce, you can probably speak to that in your context as well. Like this idea of like kind of launching all these campaigns that and you know supporting all of these like social and political movements that are for your people, that are for a broad base of people, but then kind of being marginalized within like within your people is like actually a really hard thing, but it's a really necessary thing. So I think the work is just kind of like showing up even when we don't feel loved or you know like identitarily affirmed, and just understanding that some of these issues, some of these issues around Palestine, for example, issues around just, I don't know, I don't even know where to start with like all of the like ways that America is just like socially and like infrastructurally just like so underserved and so just like hating of poor people and working people and unhoused people, but still showing up in a central role to all of those fights, even when we don't necessarily like have all of our needs met, like within LGBTQ community, like just kind of still moving forward in coalition with other like working and disenfranchised people, I think is, and just not getting too comfortable. I think a lot of, I think because of some of the gains and some of the visibility gains in recent years, like there's a lot of just kind of like comfort resting on one's laurels within the American queer community. But that's just really, to be honest, it's just like very insidious. It's just smoke and mirrors, and it's a tool of the oppressor. So those are my remarks, and I'll pass it back to you, Deonce, to end.
Yeah, no, I think there is danger in comfort, and we're seeing it globally. We're literally seeing it globally. We had all these amazing wins, and we were all there comfortable in a corner, and then Europe came for trans rights. America started. Africa is going backwards as well. We're seeing all these draconian laws and things pop up. And I think it's because as activists, we got comfortable with the small wins that we got. We were not thinking about, okay, so same-sex marriage is now legal, then what? The same conversation I'm having with sex workers right now as they are preparing their advocacy. And I keep saying to them, decriminalization, and then what? What are the next steps? So when you're going to put this together, put it together in such a way that we are not repeating the historic mistakes of the gay struggle and of the women's struggle. Because when we made it a single person issue, when we made it a single issue fight, That's, I think, where the struggle is and where I think we need to improve a little bit more. Because also part of my advocacy right now, as I keep saying to people, yes, today they're coming for LGBT human rights. Tomorrow they're coming for abortion, right? After that, they might be coming, God, Namibia just passed or just tabled a bill that wants to stifle and control public gatherings. What does that even mean when you want to police demonstrations and say in your bill that if people use a particular type of language, police have the right to shut that protest down? Where are we going? Why are we repeating apartheid era laws? So the moment they come for one population and you sit quiet and you are complacent, they will come for the next and they will come for the next. And before we know it, we are back in 19 God knows what, where we were living in oppression all over again. And that our freedom fighters fought their colonizers so that they can just come and occupy the chair of colonizer all over again. So I think there is a need for a deeper unity, a need for a deeper understanding and empathy for each other's issues, and be able to intersect in such a way that is responsible, that recognizes everybody at the table, and that for heaven's sake, there is no such thing as a voiceless person. We all have voices. We just need the space to be facilitated for us to be able to express these voices. And if you do take up space on behalf of somebody at that point when they were not ready, hand over the baton to that community when you have helped that community to walk the walk and gained the necessary strength to be able to speak for themselves. I know I keep saying to people, transgender women allowed, you can hear us from back there. There is no way you can say we are the voiceless. So I think that primarily is it for me. The struggles across the board, as we can see, are the same, with some unique nuances here and there. But I think there is a need for deeper solidarity as queer people, as LGBT people, as feminist people, to be able to get this. I don't want to call it a fight because I'm so tired of fighting. At this point, I'm exhausted. Guys, we are tired of fighting, I think. We probably just want to get to a common understanding. And the people that we are fighting are not hearing us, so we need to find more innovative ways. We need to find more creative ways. We perhaps need to learn from our elders and how they did the things back in the day, and just be able to tweak the plan a little bit so that we can, because I believe we can get this world to a better place. People keep asking me, the way Namibia is looking, am I leaving? I'm not leaving until things get really, really scary. At this point, they're not scary, and I'm not planning to leave anywhere because I think there is room for Namibia to be able to do the things that can get done to protect everybody. And we need all of us on this call. We need all of us that are going to be watching this to stand up and speak for each other, because you can't sit quiet over there. The reason why I am out here exhausting myself doing all this kind of work with so many different communities is because I refuse to sit quiet when there is an injustice happening to another human being. They don't need to be trans, they don't need to be lesbian, they don't need to be Black. As long as it's another human being and there is an injustice being experienced there, you will find me at that protest. You will find me in front of that house. You will find me in front of that parliament building protesting, because injustice against one person, I think, is injustice against us all.
And with that, those words, we're going to end. Thank you all very much for those who were able to come to the live, and those who are watching this later on. Thank you so much for coming through. And for the panel, just maybe give everybody a round of applause. Thank you so much for your time. for your energy, for your love, for your struggle. I'm just so happy for this. And BAP, Black Alliance for Peace, thank you so much for providing this space for us. So with that, Netfa, Imani, I think we're good. If you wanted to